All right, so now we get to solve one of the problems that we've been working on, the setup of. This is a mixed constraint problem, as you can see. You may notice it's much more simple. That's going to be the theme as you're working on these problems. The problems you actually have to solve are much more simple than the ones I would ask you simply to set up. I'm assuming you can set up the initial tableau here. You should make sure you can. And once you do, if you do it correctly, your initial tableau should look like the following. Don't forget to label your columns. So this is x1, x2, s1, s2, and this is z. Since we didn't change this as one a minimization, that is actually z. So you might be tempted to pivot here because of the -1, but remember that isn't what we're doing yet. Because I have a negative over here, I know that I'm outside of the feasible region. And so what we're going to have to do is something called phase 1 pivots. So phase 1 means that you're not in the feasible region, but you're going to do pivots to get there, and you're not going to follow the usual rules of simplex to do those pivots. So a pivot will still mean the same thing. Turn the pivot entry into 1 through multiplication and then use that 1 to get rid of entries above and below it. But how you pick it will be different. You will pick a negative as your last entry. You'll pick a row that has a negative as the last entry. There's only one of those. And then you'll pivot on one of the values that are negative in that row. We have only one. I just picked the first one, no particular reason. You could have also pivoted here. So what you'll do is you'll pivot on this value and you'll continue to do this process until there's no negatives in this right-hand column. That may take one pivot, it may take multiple pivots. And so as a first step, I need this to be a 1, so very easily I can multiply by -1, and I get the following tableau. So I get 1, 1, -1, 0, 0, 10, and everything else stays the same. Now you may get excited saying, hey, we don't have a negative in that right-hand column, but remember we haven't completed our pivot yet. We haven't completed our pivot until we use this one to get rid of things above and below it, in this case below it. So the way I do that is I do -2 row 1 and I do plus row 1. And so now I end up with 1, 1, -1, 0, 0, 10. Nothing happens to that first row, right? And then after that, I end up with 0, 3, 2, 1, 0, 40, and then 0, 3 -1, 0, 1, 0. That's the completion of one pivot. So remember, the pivot includes changing that value to a 1 and performing the row operations to get rid of stuff above and below it. Now I can say, because in this last column we have no negatives, that I am in the feasible region. That means I can now follow simplex. So I am now in phase 2. Phase 2 is follow simplex according to the typical rules. So now pick a negative in the last row, and then pick the smallest positive divisor, or number resulting from dividing. And so 40 divided by 2 is 20. 10 divided by -1 is negative, so I won't use it. So I'll be using the 2. So that means I need to multiply by 1/2. So I'm going to pivot on that 2. So after I multiply by 1/2, right, only that row changes. The first row doesn't change. 1, 1, -1, 0, 0, 10. I get 0, I get 1.5, I get 1, 0.5, 0, 40. And then 0, 3, -1, 0, 1, 0. So that's completion of my first phase 2 pivot. And now what I need to do, well, not quite. That's the first step in my phase 2 pivot. And now what I need to do to complete it, right, and that's really important to make the distinction, is I need to go ahead and add here and add here. So I'm going to add row 1, and I'm going to add row 1. Then I can say I've completed it and see, okay, do I need to make any more pivots? So after I do this row operation, you can double check my values. I got 1, 2.5, 0, 0.5, 0, and 30. So you should get the same thing. The second row didn't change. And the last row becomes 0, 4.5, 0, 0.5, 1, and 40. Or excuse me, 20. Right? This should be a 20, and this should be a 20. Got to be very careful here because remember I multiplied by a half, so that should have been a half there. That's one of those things, if you've been working your homework problems, you got to catch your mistakes. As soon as you catch something off, make sure to fix it. So okay, so I got my 20, added it here, I got the 20 there. All right, so now I'm looking down here because we're in phase 2. I'm saying, are there any negatives in this last row? I don't see any, so that means we are optimal now. So if we're optimal, I need to remember what these were. This was x1, x2, s1, s2, and z. And so my optimal solution is z equals 20. Remember, we're trying to maximize. And then at x1 is 30. x2 is 0. So that will be my solution. So phase 1 pivots, only one pivot this time. Again, your pivot's complete once you do all the row operations for that pivot. In other words, you have completed your pivot when you end up with a unit column. And after 1 or 2 pivots, usually you're able to do phase 2. Phase 2 pivoting is simplex, works just as before. Be careful, right, as we were reminded here. Be careful of your arithmetic, but otherwise it's the same thing from the previous section. The key is paying attention to, do you have a standard maximization? Because then it's all simplex. Or do you have mixed constraints like this? That's when you have the phase 1 and phase 2.